This chapter talks about developmental and life course theories. So developmental and life course theories look at how our criminal behavior develops over time and changes over time. And it also looks at, as I mentioned, life course theories. How does this change over the course of our lives? So it's looking at things like what causes the onset of behavior, what causes behavior to increase or decrease, and then what causes it to stop. So research already tells us, and if you recall from, SO 105 criminology, that we know certain age groups are more actively involved in criminal behavior. You guys should be familiar with that term, the age crime curve, right? And it looks like a bell curve with criminal behavior peaking in adolescence and then declining gradually. Some research, however, shows that people are very varied in their criminal behavior as they age. So life course criminology aims to better understand that stability. And changes in criminal behavior, both within individuals over time and when we're looking at life stages, how people vary over those life stages. So developmental life course describes complexities of age-related patterns of crime. They trace various pathways of offenders over their lifetime and identifies what factors place people at risk for offending and what factors serve as protective factors. So things that, even if someone may be at risk, what prevents them from engaging in criminal behavior. So we've got some general theoretical questions of developmental life course theories. So what is the key construct underlying offending? What factors encourage or inhibit offending? Is there a learning process for offending? Is there a decision-making process? How is the theory structured? When we think about the constructs within the theory, how do we define them? What does the theory explain or not explain? And what findings could challenge this theory? So can we test the theory? Crucial tests include how much does the theory make different predictions from another theory? This leads to some specific empirical questions. So when people are conducting research and they're looking at developmental life course theories, what are some specific questions that they use? So why do people start offending? How are onset sequences, onset referring to when the criminal offending begins, explained? Why is there this continuity across adolescence in terms of offending? Why does that age crime curve exist? Why do people stop offending? Why does it peak in our teen years? We know that early onset, the sooner someone engages in criminal behavior, the more likely they are to engage in a long criminal career. Why? Why is there versatility in offending? Why does co-offending, so offending with another person, decrease from adolescence to adulthood? Why are there between individual differences? So how come the life course isn't the same for everybody? What are some of the risk factors for onset and desistance, and how do we explain the fact that they're risk factors? Why is there offending even within individuals, so over our lifetime and over a short-term period? What are the main motives and reasons for offending, and what are the effects of life events on offending? So how do things that are happening in our lives impact our offending? So as I mentioned, we have this age crime curve, and this is discovered by Hirschi and Gottfredson. This is the idea that the crime rate typically increases from early adolescence, peaks in mid to late teen years, and then there's a sharp decrease in early adulthood. This relationship between age and crime is one of the most indisputed facts in criminology. There is overwhelming support for this relationship. Modern criminal career research, so when we're looking at someone's criminal career, looks at if, how, and why certain factors influence the onset of that behavior, continuation and escalation of it, or the desistance of it. So Moffitt is one of the better known researchers in this field, and she puts forth this idea that you might be familiar with, that there are adolescent limited offenders, so offenders who engage in fairly typical deviant criminal behavior during their adolescent years, and then stop offending. So they pretty much adhere to that age crime curve. Then she also found what she calls persistent chronic offenders. They start offending sooner, they engage in more violent offending, and they tend to offend for a longer period of time. So when Moffitt's doing her research, she looks at a birth cohort. It's a group of people born in the same year. She looks at 1,000 of them in New Zealand. And she found when she asked them to self-report on their offending by the age of 18, that somewhere between 86 and 91% of people have engaged in some criminal offending by the time they turn 18. She also looks at frequency of offending. This is the number of offenses committed by active offenders in a given time period. So this is represented by the lambda. Okay, so it generally peaks at age 16 when we're looking at self-report, and when we look for official convictions, we see that around age 17 to 20, with an average offender committing about 8 crimes per year during the time they're actively offending. Now, when we look at offenders who've been previously incarcerated, that's as many as 30 to 50 crimes per year. Research also tells us about the age of onset, which is the age at which first crime is committed, and that ranges from 13 to 19. Research has found that for shoplifting, it peaks at 13/14, and for assault, around 17 to 19. So as I mentioned earlier, the earlier someone's offending onsets, the more likely it is that they will engage in a longer criminal career. So this means if you're working with youth and you see kids who are engaging in behavior at a young age and engaging in more serious behavior, those are kids we want to take a little bit more time with, and we should be a little bit more concerned with. Now, age of desistance is the age at which the last offense is committed. This is difficult to assess, but the average age is in your 20s, 20 to 29. We can use that age of onset and the age of desistance to calculate the length of someone's criminal career. Now, when we exclude offenders who only offend one time, we get about 10.4 years for the average length of criminal careers. When we do include the one-time offenders, that brings it down to about 7.1. If we're measuring it from first police contact to last arrest, it's about 17.3 years. So what do these theories tell us? Well, first we have Moffitt's taxonomy, which I just mentioned to you guys. We have adolescent limited offenders. Onset occurs early in their adolescent years, and they desist as they mature and generally stop offending. Life course persistent offenders begin earlier in their adolescence, and they continue to engage. They do not desist. We tend to see conduct disorders with them at a very young age, and they engage in increasingly serious forms of misbehavior. What are some causes then of childhood antisocial behavior? So one thing that research indicates might be different between those adolescent limited offenders and life course persistent offenders is the individual traits. So your individual traits are more likely to make you an adolescent limited versus a life course persistent offender. So things like low verbal ability, hyperactivity, impulsive personality, those are issues or indicators that someone may become a life course persistent offender. Peer influence is much more prominent, plays a bigger role in adolescent limited offending than it does in life course persistent offending. Loeber also developed a pathway, developmental pathways model, and identified 3 different pathways of how someone's criminal career might develop. The first is the overt developmental pathway. With these offenders, they initially show low levels of aggressive behavior that escalates into more aggressive behavior, including things like physical fighting, and ultimately leads to serious violent behavior. The covert developmental pathway, we usually see offending begin prior to the age of 15. We see early life course involvement in minor covert criminal behavior, lying, shoplifting. We see that escalate to property damage and fraud, and then we see it escalate to serious delinquency like theft and burglary. And then his third pathway is the authority conflict developmental pathway. Again, we see early onset here, prior to age 12, and we see stubborn, defiant, disobedient behavior, and it's generally targeted towards authority figures like parents and teachers. This will then escalate to other authority avoidance, running away, staying out late, skipping school. Loeber recognizes, though, that people could progress through more than one pathway, but early studies do show support for overt, covert, and authority conflict pathways. But we need a great deal more research to test the veracity of this perspective. Gottfredson and Hirschi talk about self-control theory. They developed this in 1990, and they're basically arguing that self-control is the key difference between Lack of self-control is what leads people to become offenders. And where does self-control develop? It develops from our parents. So parents who neglect to engage in effective supervision, who don't recognize and correct their children's bad behavior, they won't develop sufficient levels of self-control. He also argues that, or they both argue, that our levels of self-control are largely set by age 8. So if someone is lacking self-control by age 8, they're highly likely to engage in a variety of misbehavior and misconduct. The fact that there is stability in criminality relative to others over the life course is referred to as population heterogeneity. So criminality here is accounted for by individual differences in our propensity to be an offender. Sampson and Laub, these are two really big, important guys in this field of theory. They argue that onset, persistence, and desistance depend on events that occur in our life, and those events can either enhance or diminish the risk of criminal behavior. And they refer to this as state dependence, because changes in criminal behavior or conforming behavior over time depend on these events. So Sampson and Laub have put together what they call age-graded theory of informal social control. And they draw heavily from Hirschi's social bond theory. And what they basically argue that turning points make a big deal in our lives, and they can increase our social bonds to society. And some of the main turning points that have been researched are marriage, stable employment, and military service. So essentially, if someone could be engaging in offending behavior, and one of these turning points could act as a turning point in their lives to increase their social bonds to society, and therefore decrease their offending. They used some data that Sheldon and Glueck used in prior years, and it was from subjects born between 1924 and 1935. So for some of these people, they actually had data on them into their 70s, and they found support for their theory looking at this data. Alex Picaro, who's a researcher out of UT Dallas, found that marriage and full-time employment lowered recidivism among parolees in emerging adulthood. Emerging adulthood is ages 18 to 25-ish, and essentially for people who had committed a crime, served time, and been paroled, if they got married, if they found some gainful full-time employment, they were less likely to recidivate. Chris Uggan, who's a sociologist out of Minnesota, I believe, found employment also found that employment lowered self-reported recidivism among offenders 27 and older. Now, the subjects of this original research were male white offenders. So that means this research might not apply to non-male white offenders. One thing that's hard to look at here, right? So if we're talking about offending that occurs over a long period of time, it's pretty rare for us to have data that follows the same group of people for a long period of time. That makes it difficult to research this. Giordano studied male and females at age 16 and then followed up 13 years later and did not find support. One of the arguments here, though, is that the sample was still relatively young for turning points. So these people were 16 when they first looked at them, and then 29 when they looked at them later on. So they may not have been old enough to have experienced some of these turning points. Women were more likely to cite religion and children as reasons for changes in their behavior. Men were more likely to cite prison time. Sampson and Laub interpreted their findings using social bond theory. Moore, however, points out that their findings are consistent with social learning theory. Marriage is followed by a dramatic decline in time spent with friends. So maybe this is a reduced exposure to deviant peers that's leading to this reformed behavior. Akers and Lee found both sets of variables, so social bonds and social learning, to impact adolescent substance abuse, with social learning variables having a stronger impact. Crone found gang participation had negative effects on those later taking on conventional roles. Sampson and Laub went back, they added some more nuances to their theory, and they drew more specifically upon variables from other theories like social learning, strain, and routine activities. Some attempt to explain what produces the age-crime relationship, some are positing different causes of crime depending on age, and some are arguing that age-related variations in the causes of crime account for it. So just remember that this is a relatively new field, and so we don't have probably enough research yet to make some definitive conclusions here. Benson argues that continuity and change are central concepts to life course perspectives, and that continuity is based on cumulative continuity. Behavior and events at one time in our life have an effect on later opportunities, right? So if you had been in trouble with the law at one point in your life, that could then impact employment, which we know impacts criminal behavior. It also is based on what's called self-selection. So do we select similar behavior at both earlier and later stages in our life? And is that consistent then with our individual personality traits? So change then is based on developmental changes and changes in our circumstances. Here, biological and early childhood effects are relatively weak. Each stage in the life course presents factors either conducive to criminal behavior or factors that could inhibit that criminal behavior. So think about things like economic and social disadvantage. The more of that you've had in your life, if that is cumulative, that contributes to persistence in offending. Whereas marriage, family, children, and employment promote desistance from offending. Antisocial behavior in turn impacts employment and marriage. So a key question here then is, does life course criminology produce new theories, or is it really looking at concepts and propositions that already exist in a new way? So Giordano has a life course perspective on social learning. So remember, definitions favorable to the law, the more we see the law as a favorable thing, the more that increases our potential to follow the law. We can also then start to redefine how we see the law as we age. And that can be impacted, of course, by our life experiences. And that redefining that can be influential in desisting. So things that you might have thought of when you were a kid as, okay behavior, things you might have done as a teenager, you might now look at unfavorably. So our definitions of crime are learned through how we're socialized, and that can be redefined throughout our life. So Giordano did a preliminary test, this is from 2015, using the Toledo Adolescent Relationship Study data. Farrington argues for what he calls integrated cognitive antisocial potential theory. And in 2005, he integrated cognitive antisocial potential. He focuses here on the between individual differences to account for the development of offenders. So what are differences between me and each of you? And aims to explain why offenders might commit crime in certain situations throughout our life course, but not in other situations. So one thing he talks about is antisocial potential. What is our propensity to exhibit antisocial or criminal behavior? And then he argues that crime is a product of short-term and long-term antisocial potential. So short-term antisocial potential is what's going on in our immediate situation and what opportunities are immediately available to us. Whereas long-term AP is influenced by cognitive and developmental factors. So crime occurs due to a combination of these. What are our individual traits? What's our cognitive and developmental traits? And what kind of immediate situations and opportunities exist? So the situation matters, the person matters, and the interaction between the situation and the person matters. So what are some risk factors then for long-term antisocial potential? Inadequate parenting, impulsivity, poor social skills. This sounds a lot like the same things that impact low self-control. For short-term antisocial potential, elements of routine activity theory, right? So is there a motivated offender? Is there a suitable victim? Is there a lack of capable guardians? Alcohol and drug use, delinquent peers, and the type and range of offenses that someone is capable of committing. These impact then an individual's behavior in a particular situation. However, there's not very many empirical studies on this. So we do know that those long-term risk factors are related to delinquency. We've seen that in terms of self-control theory. But improving these short-term factors improves the model. It means that the model then becomes better at predicting offending. So here's some widely accepted conclusions from developmental life course research. We know that offending peaks in our late teen years. The peak age of onset for offending is between 8 and 14, and the peak age of desistance is between 20 and 29. The earlier the onset age is, the longer the criminal career will be. There is continuity in offending and antisocial behavior that we see from childhood to teen years to adulthood. A small fraction of the population commits a large fraction of all crimes. We've seen this in several studies, right? We often refer to them as chronic offenders. Offending is versatile. Most people are not specialized offenders, specializing in one particular type of offense, but generally people are versatile. The acts defined as offenses are elements of a larger syndrome of antisocial behavior. So there's criminal behavior, but there's a variety of other antisocial behavior. Most offenses up to our late teen years, we're committing those with other people, right? So generally the dumb stuff we do growing up, we do with our friends. Most offenses from age 20 on are committed alone. The reasons given for offending up to the late teenage years are quite variable. They're utilitarian. Sometimes people are doing things for excitement or enjoyment, or because they're angry. We also know then that the age of onset is different for different types of crimes. So different types of offenses are first committed at distinctly different ages. Okay, so if this theory explains criminal offending, what are policy implications? So with all theories, what we're looking for is if they're explaining why someone begins offending, then we should be able to use that reason to figure out how to address that behavior, right? What policy should we put in place? So one thing it looks like we should be doing then is focusing on early prevention and intervention. When we see kids having a hard time in early childhood and we don't address that, that's probably going to escalate. Early onset is associated with a lengthy criminal career. So we really, again, want to intervene early. And the financial toll of that can reach upwards into millions of dollars. So while those high-rate chronic offenders may be a small group, they are disproportionately responsible for the amount of offending and the costs associated with it. So we want to invest resources in policies and programs aimed at early life course prevention and intervention. So cognitive behavioral therapy, child skills training. We want to teach kids self-control and how to modify that. A recent meta-analysis, you may recall a meta-analysis is where someone goes back and looks at all the empirical studies dealing with a particular topic and reanalyzes it. When we look at early family parenting training and nurse home visitation programs, these are both effective in reducing problem behavior and delinquency, both in the short term and the long term. And that wraps up this chapter. If you guys have any questions, let me know.